this introductory course, we'll touch on one or two matters of an introductory nature, and the first of them concerns phonetic transcription. I think almost all of you know something about phonetic transcription. Some of you may imagine that transcription is what phonetics is about. No. Phonetic transcription is a useful tool for anybody studying pronunciation, but it's not the purpose of phonetics just to use funny symbols. They're a convenience for us because they enable us to refer in writing to sounds, and to do so in a way that is direct and unambiguous. Ordinary spelling in English, as I'm sure you're aware, is very inconsistent and uncertain and indeed ambiguous, and that's why it doesn't enable us to refer directly to pronunciation. Would you like to take a handout, latecomers? No? Right, there are one or two other people who came in and haven't got a handout yet. We were just talking about phonetic transcription, which enables us to refer unambiguously to the sounds that we want to describe or imitate or discuss. To take just one example, if we start the names of the days of the week, how do we pronounce these? Well, one thing that is not at all obvious from the spelling is that the first two rhyme. We say Sunday, Monday. We've got the same vowel sound in each of those, even though the spelling is different. Now, by transcribing the first syllable with this special phonetic symbol, we do, of course, reveal that they have the same sound, even though the spelling is misleading and might lead you to think that there was a difference between the vowel of Sunday and the vowel of Monday. Next question, how do they end? I've just been saying Sunday, Monday. However, it's also perfectly possible to say Sunday, Monday. For us to discuss the question, do we say Sunday or Sunday, do we say Monday or Monday, we can use phonetic symbols to specify explicitly the pronunciation we're talking about. I shall be telling you, or somebody else will be telling you in due course, that this is a question of vowel weakening. There are certain positions in certain words where we have a choice about weakening, where we can leave the vowel strong, Sunday, Monday, or we can weaken it, Sunday, Monday. In fact, in this set of words, both pronunciations are perfectly correct and perfectly acceptable. In general, if we're putting weight on this word, I'll do it on Sunday. We're likely to use day, but if it's not in such a powerful position, but surrounded by other words, on Sunday morning I'm going to on Sunday morning, we're more likely to use the weakened version of the vowel. Now, by using phonetic symbols, we can draw attention to this choice, to these two possibilities of pronunciation. So, phonetic symbols are very useful. One little problem, though, is that different phoneticians, different books, different authors have at different times and places used different sets of symbols for English. And so I just want to look briefly at this little problem. The difficulty arises in particular in reference to the paired vowels, long vowels and short vowels, that we have if we compare, for example, sheep and ship, quart, and cot. In the older phonetic works associated with the name of Daniel Jones, my illustrious predecessor as Professor of Phonetics, who founded this department, founded the Department of Phonetics as it then was at University College. Now, in his works, most of them, not all of them, he makes use of a phonetic notation which uses the same symbol for the E of sheep as for the I of ship. The same letter I, but with and without the length marks after it. So that he shows this difference, sheep and ship, by putting the length marks for the long vowel and not putting them for the short vowel. Well, this is okay, but it overlooks, or it doesn't draw attention to the fact that there is a difference of quality quite apart from the difference of length. The E of sheep is E, the A of ship is E, there's a difference E. So, Abercrombie and various other people, including Jones himself in some of his works, alternatively suggested that we have a difference in symbol shape rather than distinguishing them by length marks. So we have the ordinary letter I for the E of sheep and a special symbol. Abercrombie used a curly iota. Nowadays we usually use a small cap I like that. Anyhow, a different shape of letter for the I of ship. Jones's notation is sometimes referred to as being quantitative, because it lays emphasis upon quantity or length, whereas Abercrombie's notation can be called qualitative, because it lays emphasis upon the vowel quality involved. You can see that the distinction for E and I is paralleled by one for O and O, so Jones has got the same special letter with and without length marks. Abercrombie uses those two, and also for U and O, where Abercrombie uses one of these two special letters to go with the long U. Well, now this was a burning issue 30 years ago, 25 years ago. Which of these notations do we use? A quantitative one or a qualitative one? Gimson, my more immediate predecessor as Professor of Phonetics, resolved this difficulty by devising a transcription that was both quantitative and qualitative, which both uses length marks and uses special letters for the vowel distinctions of quality. So Gimson's notation in the third column, you will see, uses the length marks for the long vowels, sheep and quart, but special letter shapes for the short vowels, ship, cot. Now it is true that this notation is redundant, because it tells you the same thing twice. But there's quite a lot to be said in favour of redundancy, because if your eyesight isn't very keen, or if you're needing all the help you can get, it's helpful to be told something twice. Well, Gimson's initiative has been very widely followed in the EFL world, English as a foreign language, and really has become a standard, and that's what we use, therefore, in this department for all our work nowadays. But there are one or two further little matters of transcription that I must talk further about now. Everybody says, why do you have to keep messing with the transcription? Leave it as it is, don't keep confusing us. Well, one of the problems is that the language doesn't stay unchanged. And And one particularly interesting change that seems to be happening at present concerns the vowel at the end of words like happy. Now look at the bottom of that table you've got on the handout, the word happy. For Jones, as for Abercrombie, this had a short vowel equated with the I of ship, happy, happy. And also for Gimson, happy. And this is fine, this is the traditional received pronunciation, quality, quality, in words of that type. However, things are changing. Millions of speakers, including many speakers whose speech is otherwise received pronunciation, now use a rather closer and tenser quality, and say happy, very, sorry, nicely, okay, with an E, which they may well identify with the E of sheep rather than with the I of ship. I've been teaching now for, believe it or not, 30 years in this department, and of course I mainly teach native speakers of English, not foreign learners. And when I give them a list of phonetic symbols, I give them a keyword for each symbol, and then I make them do an exercise transcribing a text in ordinary spelling, converting it into phonetic symbols. They have a free choice. They think, how do I say this? And they write down what they think they say. Well, they may not be always correct in what they think they say. That's another problem. But what is interesting is the gradual shift I've noticed over the years in the proportion of students who, forced to choose between E and I in a word like happy, instead of the traditional happy, offer me happy. And I can't say they're wrong. They're not wrong. That is the way they pronounce it. On the other hand, it's not a matter of enormous importance. In fact, precisely not. Because in this position, it doesn't matter whether it's I or E, because in this position, it can't make any difference to the meaning of the word. Now, in a stressed syllable, in an ordinary word of one syllable, it's very important. There's a big difference between leaving and living. Leaving is going away, living is existing or being in a particular place. So it's vital to distinguish between leaving and living. There's a big difference between green and grin. Green is a colour, grin is a kind of smile. Equally, there's a big difference between sheep and ship. But there is no possible difference at all between happy and happy, or between very and very, or between sorry and sorry. Now, linguistically, we describe this as a position, therefore, of neutralization. Neutralization refers to the phonological opposition which applies in other places between E and I. The fact that green and grin, beat and bit, mean different things can be said linguistically by saying that there is an opposition between the vowel E and the vowel A. But in this position, there's no opposition. The opposition is raised, suspended, neutralized. Right, what to do about this? Well, the Longman Dictionary of Contemporary English was the pioneer. But many authors have since followed this, including Roach, whose book some of you will know, English Phonetics and Phonology, and including my own Longman Pronunciation Dictionary, and including this course. Because what we do is to use a special compromise symbol, which is the ordinary letter I, without the length marks, and without the special shape. And so I use this symbol wherever the E-I contrast doesn't apply, wherever the opposition is neutralized, which includes in particular at the ends of words like happy and before a vowel in an unstressed syllable in words of the type various. Okay? radiate which equally were identified by Jones with a short I, but where I think even more people than in Happy nowadays tend to use a tensor quality, various radiate. So this is an innovation in the notation which we think is useful for two reasons. Firstly, because it reflects an important current development in English pronunciation. And secondly, because it reflects the linguistic situation more accurately in that we identify the suspension, the neutralization of the opposition. Now there's one other problem about notation which concerns the vowel in words like coat. Again, that's on your handout. And here again, we're faced with a change in reality. 100 years ago, people said, oh, this is my coat. She won't go. She won't go alone. Nowadays, we say, this is my coat. Oh no, she won't go. She won't go alone. And this is a real change in the mainstream pronunciation for this vowel. I don't doubt that 100 years ago there may have been one or two people who said oh. Equally, there are nowadays one or two people who say oh. But it's very clear that the mainstream has moved, in that the usual pronunciation now is one that starts with an quality O, rather than with an O quality O, in the way that it used to. And that's why, again, it was Gimson who made this innovation. We no longer write the diphthong in ways starting with that letter, but in ways starting with the schwa, the symbol, the sound, the mid-central unrounded vowel, which is appropriate. Mind you, we could have written it like that because it's rather like the of bird, but anyhow, this is the symbol we chose to use. So this change in notation reflects a difference in reality, a difference in practice of native speakers. I should say furthermore that this is currently quite an important British-American difference as well, because the Americans are rather behind us in this innovation. In general, the Americans are rather conservative in pronunciation. You may be surprised to realize this, but it's clearly true that in English, on the whole, although the Americans are innovative in lexicon, in usage, in vocabulary, nevertheless they are conservative in pronunciation in many respects compared with the British. It's difficult to forecast whether O will in due course become the norm in American English, as it is now in British English, but it may well do. Most Americans, O, still say O, no. But there are already people such as the Valley Girls in California that the journalists like to write about, who say, oh no, it's gross, rather than, oh no, it's gross, as their parents would do. So it may catch on as an American custom, as it already is a British custom. Now, lastly, let's just have a little bit of theory about what we're doing. Bottom of the handout, learning pronunciation. In general, there are two aspects to the work that we're involved in. One of them is listening, recognition. The other one is speaking, production. And I do want to emphasize that both of these are important. There is a tendency to think that all we need worry about is production, and that I just came here for practical purposes, I want to learn to pronounce English better. Well, fine. But I believe that you won't be able to improve your pronunciation actively in speaking unless you also improve your perception, your listening ability. I mean, it may be perfect already, in which case nothing to say. Same is true of your pronunciation, but for most people it isn't. For most people it's useful to listen carefully and notice the difference. For example, some of you may or may, others may not, immediately hear the difference between the verb to implement a policy, and the noun and implement. A knife is an implement for cutting with. Could you all hear the difference there? Anybody like to tell me what the difference was? To implement, an implement.
Stress?
Nope. Both are stressed on the first syllable.
E and
Where?
Yeah.
At the end. Okay. This is the difference. The question, maybe that's what you meant. The question is, do we have a strong vowel or a weak vowel at this point here? We have, for this we have an I at the beginning, an I there, but what do we have at this point? The verb is to implement, the noun is an implement, and you can hear the difference. The verb is with an E, to implement, and the noun is with an implement. Now, depending on your own language background, this may be a perfectly easy contrast to hear. But if, for example, your language is Spanish, you may find this just a bit tricky. And so, it's not only a problem of producing it, but of hearing it, and of course knowing which words are appropriately said one way and which words the other way. Well, the general rule is that we have meant with e in verbs, but munt with in nouns. The one or two exceptions, but that's the general principle. A building for keeping corn in is called a barn. To use fire on something is to burn it. Difference between a barn and a burn. A barn is a building, a burn is a fire. Now, probably if you're Spanish, no problem here, obviously different. But if you're Japanese, this may be more difficult. Which is the barn? Which is the burn? Barn, burn, barn, burn, are they different? What do I do to my coffee? Do I stir it or do I stir it? Which is right, which is wrong? Most of you can usefully benefit from the listening exercises, from training your ability to recognize sounds. Because unless you know what you're aiming at, your production is not going to be able to hit the right target, because you don't know quite what the target is. Well, that's why we do ear training, to help recognition. And of course we do also give you pronunciation drills to help sound production. Clearly these differences do depend upon your mother tongue, upon your first language. Depending on what your first language is, depending what it is, you may or may not have particular problems. And so we also do contrastive analysis, where we compare and contrast one language with the other, in this case the phonetics of one language with the phonetics of another language. So it's useful for you to know something about the phonetics of your own language, the mother tongue, L1, in order to compare it with the phonetics of the target language, L2, as we call it. Because wherever there are differences, mismatches between them, we're going to be likely to find difficulties. For example, Japanese has an R vowel but has no vowel. Therefore, there are likely to be problems in the area of R. And this is known as interference, where the learner takes sounds from his own native language and uses them in the target language, perhaps inappropriately. We get transfer, inappropriate transfer from the mother tongue to the target language, and this is interference. Many of the problems of pronunciation can be put down to interference from the first language in this way. Other errors are due not so much to interference as to the inherent difficulty of the L2, in this case of English. There are some things in English that are difficult on just a general scale. Now, these inherent difficulties can be identified by seeing what children do. Children who grow up in an English-speaking environment, they do quickly learn to sound just like native speakers, but it does sometimes take 5 years or so. And, for example, small children quite often have difficulty with the sound in 3, and small children will often say 33 instead of 33. Well, this actually happens to be an easy thing for most Spaniards, because most Spaniards use a th in Spanish. But in general, it's a difficulty in English, which many foreign learners will experience just because it is a difficulty, not because they don't have that in their first language. Equally, there are consonant clusters that offer problems. I do remember myself even that I had difficulties pronouncing the word signal. And I can remember my father, when I probably was, I suppose, about 4 or 5, admonishing me, it isn't single, it's signal. You don't give a single, you give a signal. Because this is a difficult sequence of sounds. Signal. You can, in fact, put a vowel in here without disaster and say signal. But one way or the other, we've still got quite an awkward sequence of sounds for the tongue and the other organs of speech to articulate. So, inherent difficulties. Now, the third general area of problems arises from what we call fossilization, and this is really the fact that although in the first 5 years of life, the first 10 years of life, we're very good at learning pronunciation, we then grow older, we mature, and we get worse at learning pronunciation. Because we get fixed, fossilized, fixed in the patterns that we knew as a child. And although individuals vary a great deal, in general it's much more difficult for an adult to learn good native-like pronunciation than it is for a child. So we have to do what we can to overcome this fossilization. It may indeed involve unlearning some of the rules from our first language. Right, well, that gives us some kind of a theoretical introduction. It's now time for us to finish the first lecture and to move to the practical classes. Thank you all very much.